Welcome back to the online Targeted Grazing Workshop for 2015, Targeted Grazing for Vegetation Management and Landscape Enhancement. I'm Karen Launchbaugh. I'm a member of the Society for Range Management Targeted Grazing Committee, and we're the committee that's bringing this series to you so that you can learn more about how to conduct targeted grazing on lands that you might manage. This is a 5-part series. Today we're going to continue on with Module 4, Choosing the Right Animal. Today's presentation will be given by Dr. Rachel Frost. Rachel got her PhD in rangeland ecology right here from the University of Idaho in targeted grazing. She's currently working on grazing, especially integrating targeted grazing with insect biocontrol. She's also looking at the training protocols where cattle are used to enhance weed consumption. She's an author of one of the chapters in the Targeted Grazing Handbook, and her current position is as coordinator of the Missouri River Conservation District Council in Montana. She's a former chair of this committee, so she knows the work of the committee quite well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Okay, well, thank you, Karen, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone for tuning in for the next series of information in our Grazing with a Goal. During the last week, Karen really covered the basics of animal behavior and what drives animals to select or avoid certain foods. Today, I'm going to focus in on another aspect of the herbivore, some of the hardwired aspects of that herbivore, and then also how we can manipulate behaviors and how we can manipulate even some of those hardwired aspects through selection, through training, and we'll even use some medication at times to figure out how we can create a near-perfect vegetation management workforce out of just regular livestock. Specifically, we're going to cover how we can use animal husbandry to select the appropriate species and even breed of animals. We'll provide it with the correct background and conditioning. We're going to pay attention to the attributes such as age and body condition, and we'll use other pay attention to those attributes to maximize their effectiveness as well.
So we do this by focusing first on the dietary habits of individual animals. Many livestock producers have spent years selecting for uniformity in color and conformation, but we're really talking about selecting for uniformity of diet selection. And once we do that, we can create flocks and herds of animals with specific dietary habits. We might go so far as even call them designer livestock. It doesn't really it sounds kind of hard, but it's not really that difficult. We want to start with the easy part. We're going to start by selecting animals that naturally possess these desired characteristics. Then we can breed those animals that do that to enhance the desired characteristics, provided with proper training and experiences to maximize that natural ability. And finally, we can offer some nutritional or pharmaceutical performance-enhancing products. Of course, we're really only talking about anything that's legal and approved by FDA. So the goal is, once you get to the end of it, you don't have to worry about your animals being ineligible for human consumption at the end of it. So the first place to start is with those animals that already possess the desired characteristics. So just for instance, if you were out to select a jockey for your prize-winning racehorse, you'd be looking for a person that was small, a slight build, someone whose weight wouldn't interfere with that horse's ability to run. You also need someone that possesses natural skills and abilities of horses. You would likely eliminate a sumo wrestler right off the bat, because really, no matter how much they might want to be a jockey, and even if they possess some really good natural skills and abilities of horses, they just don't have the physical qualifications to be able to do that job the way you would want it done. It's the same basic concept when we start looking at selecting the correct species. And that's actually probably an underutilized aspect when we're thinking about animals specifically for vegetation management. Most of the time, we have the species of livestock that we want to raise or that we have are set up with our facilities and stuff to raise already determined, and then we're always trying to fit those livestock into whatever vegetation management that we want to do. Really, though, different species of livestock vary in their preference for different plant species, and where on the landscape they like to graze, what topography, and what different parts of the vegetation they like to graze. And so if we keep that in mind as we start, we can do a better job of actually matching our animal to the plant. And that's really the ultimate goal here, to get the best match for the best outcome. So this graph here actually shows, in an ideal world, if you were a goat, a sheep, or a cow, a concentrate, intermediate, or a roughage feeder, what you would likely make of your diet in an ideal situation. So clearly goats prefer to make the majority of their diet out of browse. They do include some grasses and some forage. Sheep are kind of the jack of all trades, and they consume almost equal amounts of each one of those if they're available, while cattle really focus in on grass, and that's where that can make up the majority of their diet. There is really some anatomical reasons why those animals stay in different categories. And it doesn't necessarily mean that a goat cannot survive on a diet of all grass. It just means they may not perform as well on it because they have specialized abilities to consume browse. A lot of browse contains different toxins in there, so goats have things like salivary glands that are designed to bind tannins. They have a higher liver to body mass ratio that helps them detoxify the tannins and other compounds that are found in browse, as well as specialized rumen microbes. Sheep have that same liver to body mass ratio advantage, and they also have specialized rumen microbes that may help in detoxifying things like alkaloids and forage. Cattle, though, not to be discounted, are really efficient harvesters. They have large mouths that are designed to bring in a lot of food at one time, pretty uniform food. And then once they get that food in their body, they have that huge rumen with that really efficient and large fermentation capacity. Well, let's think a little bit about the mouth of these animals too, because that's really an important part as well. I mentioned that cattle have a large mouth. Sheep and goats have really small prehensile mouths that allows them to select individual browse leaves and to forage among thorns and prickles. Those larger mouths of cattle with that solid upper lip doesn't allow for nearly as much selection within an individual bite. It's kind of like if you had a pile of change and you wanted to pick a single penny out of it while wearing an oven mitt. You would likely be able to get that penny after some working around, but you're probably going to get a lot of other change in your hand with it as well, because you just don't have the selective ability. That's kind of where cattle are with that larger mouth. So here are examples of how these natural differences in diet selection can play out when animals are allowed free choice access to pasture. This picture shows two adjoining pastures. The one on the right is grazed by sheep. The one on the left is not grazed by sheep. And right away you can see the difference in the amount of forbs that are on the right-hand side of the picture as the left. Controlling forbs was really not the management goal probably, but it happened anyway because of that natural preference that sheep have for forbs. For example, of the same sort of situation, we have cattle and goat grazing on the left-hand side and sheep grazing on the right-hand side. Here, instead of forbs, the most noticeable difference is in the amount and the shape of the browse that's located in these pastures. There's less browse available on the left-hand side. Goats have probably done a good job of slowing the expansion of juniper, and they've also created this nice, even utilization line up here on these live oak trees that you just don't see on the side that's been grazed by sheep. Here's another example of goats grazing, and again, notice on this right-hand side of the screen just how much less browse there is available there as compared to the left-hand side, which has not had any browsing on there. And we'll go back over a few of the things that goats have that just make them so good at controlling browse as we saw in those previous pictures. They do have those prehensile lips to get them around the spines and thorns. Goats also have abilities that cattle don't have, and that they're able to stand up on their hind legs and get up higher, reach those higher leaves on the shrubs, and that's what makes that nice even browse line that you saw in that former picture. Again, they have the increased stability through either their salivary glands or their rumen-degrading microbes, and as well as some of their enzymatic systems to handle the toxins that are often found in these shrubs. So clearly they have some really hardwired innate capabilities that make it impossible for you to make a cow eat or a goat eat. And sometimes it's really even where you can't make a goat out of a sheep. So just a few ways to show you how it's really important to match up kind of those hardwired characteristics that these animal species have with the plant species that you're trying to target. It doesn't mean that you can't get some utilization out of those different plant species. You can't get some effect and some control when you're trying to use cattle to do some type of browse control or sheep or anything else. It just means that goats really have a physiological advantage and can do a much better job in that situation. Of goats and their ability to control browse species. Gorse is a thorny shrub, and it looks like when it's grazed by sheep and here in the solid lines, it really just kind of continues to expand in the pasture. When they put goat grazing in, even at 33% of the population, that gorse is able to be kept in check on the pasture then. The selection of species of livestock that's best adapted to a particular environment can help improve your ability to target those plants too. So this is a kind of a three-dimensional depiction of both the diet and the topographic preferences of these different species. So cattle tend to prefer grasses, they tend to remain in lower elevations, closer to riparian areas. Sheep are more focused on the uplands, tend more towards forest and dietary preference, and goats, again, really like those shrubs, and they're even more of an upland preference than the sheep. So clearly, if you were just going to target an upland shrub, you usually select a goat. They're the best employee for the job, so to speak. But if you were looking more at an invasive riparian grass, such as reed canary grass, that would, of course, be best managed with cattle grazing. Here's another example about different species of animals using different topographies. It shows the percent of observations or how often animals were seen on different percent slopes. Cattle were never observed on slopes steeper than around 30%, while bighorn sheep, this dotted line, they really seem to prefer these slopes on up to 70 and 80%, which are extremely steep. So, just like a combo meal can give you more bang for your buck, running multiple species of livestock simultaneously can give you more vegetation management options for the same AUM. By combining the different diet selection tendencies of species, you have the potential to restore ecosystem balance, provide more even utilization of all forage species, so you don't see that imbalance of forage to grass like we saw in the one picture previously, and which prevents one plant from having an ecological advantage or disadvantage like we showed with the forest in that sheep picture. Once you have selected the species that's best suited for your location and vegetation management goals, you can just focus that down even finer and further improve the effectiveness of your vegetation management workforce by selecting the correct breed within those species. Breeds are something that have been developed by man, and we do different breeds to maximize the production of specific characteristics. For example, the Angora goat up here in the upper left-hand corner has been selected primarily for its ability to produce mohair or fiber. Conversely, the boar goat down in the bottom left-hand corner has been selected primarily for its meat production. And you can see the huge morphological differences between these two species. Conversely, the two species on the right-hand side of the screen, the ibex goat at the top and the Spanish goat at the bottom, have had very little human selective pressure. So this begs the question then, when we have been so intensely focused on fiber and meat production with these animals on the left-hand side of the screen, have we been unintentionally selecting for different diet selection abilities as well? I mean, they have been. It turns out when you get cattle breeds, Hereford and Tarentaise in this example, Herefords were developed in gentler terrain, while Tarentaise were developed as a breed in very mountainous terrain. And so when researchers examined the use of these two breeds even today, decades, even centuries after they were developed, they found that Tarentaise cattle still tended to use higher elevations and steeper slopes, and that Hereford cattle tended to congregate down in the lowland areas here. As managers, we can use these differences to improve the health of our riparian areas or to get more even utilization out of forages simply by putting the correct breed or changing up our production strategy a little bit on our operation. Here's another example of breed differences in diet selection. So this is consumption of juniper by goats, by Angora goats, those that were selectively bred for fiber production, and Spanish goats, who again had received very little human selective pressure. Juniper does contain monoterpenes. And the bell curve on the left is blue, that's Angora goats, and you can see that overall, as a group, Spanish goats consume more juniper than Angora goats. However, if you look down in the center part of the graph, you can see that there's a tail of that bell curve that goes way over into the high areas of juniper consumption. What that's saying is that 25% of the Angoras eat more juniper than the average Spanish goat. And on all the studies that Dr. Langebaugh was talking about earlier this month in hers, she was mentioning that this group of animals ate more than this group of animals. And as researchers, we do that. We tend to use groups of animals to determine different outcomes in research, and we take all of their intake and we average them together to get one value for each group of animals. And I did that when I was working on my master's research as well. But what I found out every time I ran a feeding trial where I was feeding them bitterweed is that there was a couple of individuals who really, by all rights, should have been dead because they were eating way over the toxic limit of bitterweed day in and day out. At that time, I was thinking they were kind of annoying because they were messing with my statistical variation and creating problems. But really, as researchers, there's been several who have started to look at it and saying, wow, those are the individuals that we really need to kind of identify and look at. And they began to embrace the individual, the animal, and how different it is, and to take that into consideration whenever we're looking at them for their abilities to do things like targeted grazing and for vegetation management. So with that tremendous variation in individual animal diet selection also comes tremendous potential in the field of targeted grazing. So we do some studies to help be able to ferret out those individuals, and Karen did one of the first ones of those. She had 18 steers that she offered feed leaves to ad libitum for 14 days. And ad libitum simply means that the animals were fed the leaves free choice, or that they constantly had leaves in front of them available to eat. And what she found was, she charted their intake over the period of the trial. She found one individual, the one depicted by the red line, that consistently consumed more than the average consumption of mesquite leaves by the entire group, which is depicted by the green line. There's also an individual depicted by the blue line that consistently consumed the least amount of mesquite leaves in the trial. So when she looked again a few other individuals, she found that the red, the purple, the blue lines, those were three individuals that consistently were above the average intake of all the other steers in the pen. So taking that into consideration, which animals would you hire if your goal was reducing mesquite on your rangeland? Well, you better be hiring 41, 48, and 42 because clearly they are very qualified, exceptionally talented individuals when it comes to mesquite control. Unfortunately, those animals were steers, so their skills and abilities and exceptional skills and abilities end whenever their life ends. If Karen really wanted to keep that increased consumption of mesquite leaves going, she could have identified the parents of those steers and bred them to produce more mesquite-eating cattle if that was her ultimate goal. So let's explore how we might be able to do that for other animals racing. I mean, after all, man has been selectively breeding animals for centuries to improve their production of food, fiber, and more animals. So let's see what we can do to apply these same selective pressures to animal for diet selection attributes. We know that attributes such as morphology, how an animal looks, its sensory abilities, its taste and smell, physical skills, and its metabolic and physiological characteristics are all inherited by an animal. At this point, really selection has focused largely on morphology, how the animal looks from the outside. We select for those characteristics that are easily determined by simply looking at the animal. We now know that herbivores inherit their ability to taste, smell, see, and feel. And since these abilities are so closely tied to diet selection and the feedback that Karen was talking about 2 weeks ago that animals receive from food, it really makes sense that differences in these abilities could also lead to differences in diet selection as well. Animals also inherit their skills and abilities. For example, race times in quarter horses are about 35% heritable. And foraging skills, such as physical dexterity, reach, strength, all of those are inherited as well, and they can affect what habitat that animal chooses to forage in and spend most of its time consuming plants. We also have research evidence that diet attributes are inherited. Snoder and colleagues, Dr. Walker was one of them, examined the inheritance of stage-eating behavior in sheep and found out that about a quarter of that variation was due to genetic factors. Similarly, researchers in Texas looked at the heritability of juniper consumption and found that it was about 13%. So inheritance is probably not the fastest way to create a herd of juniper-eating goats, but it does have potential to gradually increase your herd's propensity to eat sage or juniper and perhaps some other plants that we've yet to identify. But based on that heritability of juniper consumption that was found in Texas, researchers at Texas A&M set out to see if they could genetically create a herd of super juniper-eating goats. To do this, they started by identifying goats and individuals that were naturally high juniper consumers. And they also identified another group of individuals that were low juniper consumers. In other words, they just wouldn't hardly consume it on a voluntary basis. They have been selectively breeding these two lines of goats to see just how different they could become in their ability and tendency to consume juniper. After several years of selection and seeing evidence through feeding trials of their differences in their natural diet selection of junipers, they decided to dig deeper and see if this selective breeding was actually resulting in a physiological change in the goats, or if they could use these two lines that were so different to identify what mechanism it was internally that was creating this difference in this ability and propensity to consume juniper. So what we did was take those animals and we dosed them with a known amount of the monoterpenes that was found in juniper, and then we drew blood from them at certain intervals to see how much of those monoterpenes made it to the blood supply of the animals. Because once it's in the blood supply, it can be transported to the liver and other organs that can be damaged by monoterpenes. So it was like, it is exactly a pharmacokinetic study to look at the clearance of the drug in bloodstream, just the same as the FDA conducts whenever they're looking at clearance of human drugs in the bloodstream to see what their mode of action is. And when we conducted this study, we found out that sure enough, goats selected for low juniper consumption, which is this red line that goes up here, had 5 times more monoterpenes in their bloodstream than those goats that were selected for high juniper consumption. So that means there was 5 times more chemical in the bloodstream going to those target organs that was able to cause aversions and to make those animals sick in there. So there's definitely a physiological difference between those two animals, although we have yet to know exactly what mechanism is causing that physiological difference as well. So even though you can't really identify a high gene for consuming goat and a low gene for consuming goat by seeing them on pasture, their morphological characteristics are very similar. There's definitely something on the inside that is different because of that genetic selection within those animals. We talked a lot about behavior and how that is affected by experiences early in life, but behavior is also can be inherited. The docility or gentleness in livestock is heritable, and so are instinctive behaviors such as hunting, retrieving, and herding activity in dogs. Although these are innate behaviors, they still need to be honed with training and repeated positive reinforcement before they can be fully realized. Again, sometimes those experiences and training really can trump what the animal is hardwired. But if animals have an innate ability to consume more of some plants, we still can provide that training and reinforcement to help maximize that natural ability, just like Karen demonstrated. Remember last month, the lambs were exposed to wheat with their mother and then later consumed more wheat on their own? The same principle applies to vegetation and plants out on the rangeland. Animals that eat certain plants with their mother are likely to eat those plants later on their own. I often talk about this in workshop situations to see how close this little lamb is eating to the mouth of its mother. And since we know that animals forage in what can be a dangerous environment because there are toxic plants out there that can make them sick or even kill them, that lamb's got a pretty good role model in mother because mother survived to be an adult, and so what she eats is probably pretty safe for them to eat. About this second study where goats were exposed to blackbrush early in life and they ate more blackbrush on pasture. A group of researchers in Texas had a similar project where they exposed goats to juniper and pins at weaning, and later on they found those same goats ate more of that juniper on pasture. Most of these are chemically defended, so those exposures early in life and that short conditioning period really was able to enhance the livestock consumption of those poisonous plants in that situation. So we have other we can use training to encourage animals to eat target plants, and we can use visual cues such as the flags that's up in the tree to help attract animals to different areas. And Kathy Bose has actually used a large volume of research to develop a training protocol for teaching cattle to consume weeds on pasture. While that actual training protocol of the effectiveness has not necessarily been conclusively tested to see exactly how much the intake of weeds is increased and how long this increase is sustained, there are a lot of livestock managers who have used this training method and are really pleased with the results of it. Sometimes I really wonder if we're actually training the people or the cattle. But I think we also train people to pay a lot of attention to what our animals eat when we go through these kinds of processes. And that's really good too, because that's something that we tend to lose in our everyday management. However, no one recommends that you teach animals to eat poisonous plants ever in that case. So we're currently in the middle of a research trial to try to quantify some of the effects of training of cattle on weed consumption. We're also combining it with different stock densities, and so we have an untrained group at moderate stock density, an untrained group at low stock density, and a trained group at low stock density, and then also control pastures that aren't receiving any grazing. We've got equal stocking rates across those treatments, and they're finishing up some data collection on it this summer. I believe we'll have the last year of that possibly, and those results should be coming out soon, and be very excited to see what they create. I looked at stock density in that trial because it really can be a powerful management tool for increasing consumption of some plants and in creating more even utilization. We've used increased stock densities of cattle to manage Canada thistle and even broom snakeweed, which maybe causing some raised eyebrows right now because broom snakeweed can cause abortions in cattle. But the key to using grazing management and stock density is don't force animals onto plants without alternative forage. They did this with smaller pastures, and so every day the cattle were moved to a fresh pasture, and so along with the broom snakeweed, they also had access to other alternative forage that can alleviate and basically dilute the effects of those toxins in those animals and make it not have those negative effects and cause abortion. Along with management, there were a number of animal attributes. Start with age. We also discussed body condition and gender that are really part of your animals. And if you don't take those attributes into consideration as you plan a targeted grazing protocol, these are some of the ones that can really get you into a wreck. Because Dr. Cott, who was the former sheep extension specialist at Montana State University, used to say, you can ask a sheep a question, just don't ask that sheep the same question twice and expect to get the same answer both times. And that's true because the animals change over time. Their nutritional requirements change, their experiences that they have changed, and so they're going to make foraging decisions differently throughout their life based on these changes. Additionally, some of the specific ways that age influences diet selection is that younger animals obviously have higher nutritional requirements. They're actively growing, and so they need that extra nutrition to fuel that growth. Also, condition of teeth. Young animals have really nice, solid mouths. As animals get older, their mouths start to break down. They start becoming broken, as we would refer to them in sheep sometimes, where other forage can slip through the cracks in those teeth, or they're not able to process the foods fully before they swallow them. So that can affect their intake and the foods that they decide to eat. In general, as you might expect, especially younger animals are more willing to try novel foods. They're generally more adventuresome and willing to take chances, and so they'll try something new a little bit quicker. And then younger animals also are a little bit more efficient in the function of their hepatic system and on enzymes that are important for detoxification of plants as well. Let's talk about another attribute that's important when you're thinking about a targeted grazing application, and that is the body condition of those animals whenever you head out to a job. Animals in lower body condition tend to have increased dry matter intake. That makes sense. They're skinny. They're really trying to fill in those nutritional voids there, and that's the way they do that is by eating more food. Conversely, though, the size of their hepatic organs, primarily that liver, shrinks whenever they lose body condition. So that takes away that advantage of that liver mass to body mass ratio that they were having, which enabled them to detoxify plants better. And then also the efficiency and function of that hepatic system is going to decline with the size of that organ as well. And then research conducted by a graduate student of Karen's in Idaho found that when animals were in a lower body condition, if you expose them to toxins, in this case it was sheep being exposed to alkaloids, just like that previous slide we saw where those low juniper-consuming animals had higher blood levels of monoterpenes, sheep in low body condition had higher blood levels of alkaloids when they were exposed to them too. So it shows that there's definitely a physiological impact to losing body condition that decreases that animal's ability to handle those toxic compounds. So be sure if you're going in to try to do some kind of a chemically defended vegetation management project, particularly with browse or alkaloids, that you animals are in good body condition and physiological able to handle those challenges. We looked at this in the combination of both age and body condition in my dissertation, looking at how body condition and age affected consumption of red-berry juniper. So I had 10 animals in each group. We had young animals in low body condition, young animals in high body condition, and the same for mature animals as well. And what we found here was that the younger goats were more apt to consume the juniper. The low body condition goats were more apt to turn to those biologically defended plants, because the low body condition consumed more of the juniper than the high body condition did. So there was also some other research on body condition and toxic plant intake. Again, one of Karen's graduate students was also looking at cattle in low body condition, and she found that they actually went to eating lupin in a pasture faster than cattle that were in average body condition. So again, demonstrating that those low body condition animals are looking for ways to increase that intake and fill those nutrient voids, even if it means turning to toxic plants. The same was demonstrated by Pfister and his colleagues, where they found that intake of ponderosa pine by cattle was 5 times greater when they were in low body condition than in average body condition. Gender also influences diet selection. This is something that a lot of targeted grazers try to take into account. Males are larger in their overall body size. They generally intake more in order to get more forage. Sometimes that forage oftentimes is lower nutritional value overall. But the main thing that really affects gender is the reproductive cycle and the associated nutritional needs that comes with it. Males usually have an increase in dietary requirements during the breeding season, while the largest nutrient demand for females is during gestation and lactation. In fact, though, what's interesting about this is that the high nutrient content of some weeds may actually help females meet this increased demand for nutrients. Dr. Walker demonstrated in the study that he conducted that sheep that were grazing on leafy spurge actually weaned heavier lambs than their counterparts that were grazing on land that didn't have any leafy spurge on it as well. So again, matching the animal's nutritional requirements with the nutritional qualities of that plant, thinking about the age of those animals, their gender, and their body condition as you head into a vegetation management job are all really important attributes too. And how we can kind of play with individual animals by offering them nutritional or pharmaceutical products to aid in digestion, and more specifically, to aid in being able to handle plants that have some kind of secondary compounds in them. The first thing we'll look at is animals need plenty of other nutrients and forages to help intake. And they use these supplements to buffer the effects of toxins. We can improve the metabolism of toxins by fueling those detoxification pathways and maintaining that healthy liver weight and mass. And then specific supplements can actually counter the negative impacts of specific toxins. For example, polyethylene glycol increases the intake of foods that contain tannins by both sheep and goats by binding with those tannins and rendering them biologically inactive. Unfortunately, it's pretty spendy, so usually in a pasture situation it becomes cost prohibitive. Activated charcoal is another way that you can increase consumption of, in this case, juniper by goats. Activated charcoal is actually the same stuff that is administered to humans whenever they go into the emergency room for poisoning situations, because of the different charged ions, and it combines with the toxin and renders it biologically inactive. Unfortunately, short of those acute kind of administration potentials for it, it's really not easily given to animals, and they're still trying to find ways that they could process it into feed to make it actually usable on a large scale. Both of these are still kind of used on a research scale, I guess it would say, instead of a pasture and application scale for livestock. There is something that you can easily do on a larger scale and is more applicable to increase consumption of plants that contain monoterpenes, and that is supplementing with protein or energy. In this case, in a study conducted by Utah, intake of sagebrush more than doubled for both sheep and goats when they were supplemented with energy and protein. The unsupplemented ones are the blue bar and the supplements are the yellow bar. thing was seen when we looked at consumption of juniper by goats. In this case, they were supplemented by protein, and again, they more than doubled that consumption whenever they were able to receive that protein supplementation. So, in conclusion, to create those designer livestock, you would start by selecting those animals that naturally possess those desired ingestive characteristics. Start with the easy stuff, the things that are already in place and that are hardwired. If you can do that, then you can continue to expand the herd of those animals by breeding them with these abilities. Again, this is still a slow process, though. So you can take the animals that you have right now and you can compare those with the prescribed dietary experiences, pay a lot of attention to their attributes and their, such as age, their gender, their physiological status, and be able to use that to your advantage and also to keep you out of wrecks when you're trying to do targeted grazing projects. And then take those animals and offer them whatever nutritional supplements or even pharmaceutical resources, if that is appropriate, that you could use to aid in digestion detoxification. Most importantly, you need to take care of them properly. Because just like we would not ask someone to do a job for us without the appropriate safety equipment, we don't want to ask animals to do a vegetation management job without appropriate safety measures to protect their health and their productivity as well. So I have a list of references here available.
And with that, we're going to thank Dr. Rachel Frost for her presentation on choosing the right animal. Here are some references from her presentation. Hard to read really fast, so we're going to post those on our website. So our website is targetedgrazing.wordpress.com. And at this site, you can get information on all of the webinars in this series, including references from this presentation. So please join us online at targetedgrazing.wordpress.com or send us an email to targetedgrazing@gmail.com. Thanks so much.